Staff talks are nerve-wracking, but it's worth it to take off the mask. Thank you so much again to Leah and Gwen and Adam and all of the staff. Those of you who follow me on Facebook or Twitter will have seen a memory from 9 years ago this day at the Sewanee Conference when we were first invited by Wyatt. And it is of me giving my faculty reading in the Women's Center and my son, then 7 years old, prostrate with boredom directly under the podium. He helped me with this PowerPoint, my first, and came here. I thought he was going to listen to the talk, but he's like, it seems like it's working. I'm going to go home. So, so at least there's some self-knowledge. So during the pandemic, I started to think sort of obsessively about certain poems. Can everyone hear me? That I was really interested in and what they had in common, and started kind of putting them in a file. And at first I thought of these as keyhole moments. But in a way, maybe they're just a bunch of favorite poems of mine that do a really gutsy move, a really upping of the ante at a certain point in the poem. I'm not sure I'm going to come up with an overarching theory about them, but I thought I would enjoy exploring them with you. And I realized that one of the things they're doing, they usually, in this group of poems, include an allusion, a reference, a quotation, or a really radical shift in register. Let's see if I can do this now. Bing. Okay. So I think we all know what I'm talking about with these things, but I thought we would step back and just look a little bit at definitions. Allusion comes from the Latin ad ludere, and it really means to play towards. So there's something playful, perhaps, at the heart of allusion. And I think I just snatched these definitions off Merriam-Webster from the web. An expression designated to call something to mind without mentioning it explicitly, an indirect or passing reference. Whereas a reference is the act of mentioning something directly in speech or in writing. We know what a quotation is. And then register, which is something I think all writers use, whether it's high register or low register, comes from musical instruments, where, what's the upper part of your range or the lower part of your range. But in writing, when we talk about register, it's usually, high, formal, scientific, Latinate language versus maybe vernacular, slangy, casual language. So the first poem, this is one of my favorite poems by a poet named Robert Francis, who is not very well known. He is well known for being neglected. That is his thing. I think Robert Frost calls him, of all the great neglected poets, the greatest. So it's something to aspire to. Really, I think he's now mostly known for this poem and another poem called The Pitcher, which is a wonderful baseball poem and just a wonderful Ars Poetica. So if you're either into poetry or baseball, I would suggest looking at that one. So, sheep. From where I stand, the sheep stand still, as stones against the stony hill. The stones are gray, and so are they. And both are weather-worn and round, leading the eye back to the ground. Two mingled flocks, the sheep, the rocks, and still no sheep stirs from its place or lifts its Babylonian face. So I think you'll see what the moment I'm talking about here is at the end, which is not prepared for in the poem whatsoever, Babylonian. This poem would also work in a way without that last couplet. It would be a cutesy, adorable poem that children might memorize. So I'm kind of interested in what is gained by this Babylonian down there at the very bottom. How does that affect the poem? We've got couplets, long couplets. I think they're tetrameter couplets, and then dimeter couplets, tetrameter couplet, dimeter couplet. A lot of lines are only monosyllables. The sheep, the rocks. From where I stand, the sheep stand still. And then Babylonian takes up a lot of syllabic and metrical real estate. It makes us go back in time. It makes us go back in place or go travel a great distance. And I'm very intrigued by what that is doing. And why Babylonian? Why not, Assyrian? And thinking about what Babylon brings to us in English that some of these other words, it's not a Roman sheep or a Greek sheep. I think Babylonian sounds older and further away. It has biblical resonances. It has nursery rhyme resonances. Sorry, I'm turning. You all may know this nursery rhyme. How many miles to Babylon? 70 miles and 10. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, and back again. If your heels are nimble and your toes are light, you can get there by candlelight. It's not attested before the 19th century, but some versions of it do suggest that it might be from as old as the Crusades. And here, Babylon, it's 70 miles and 10. Robert Graves writes about this, which could also be the lifespan of a person. There's something, is it a dreamland, candlelight? So I think this brings in some of that mystique. And it makes us reread the poem. I think that's one of the main things it does, is it just hurls us back up. Like, whoa, I did not expect to get here. I'm going to reread this poem from the top. It also, I think, seems to be an almost ekphrastic poem. It's about observing and looking at things from where I stand, the sheep stand still. And that leading the eye back to the ground seems almost something out of art history or looking at a piece of art. I think putting that Babylonian in there also, for me, opens up other allusions that might not be there from the poet, but opens them up to me as I think about the poem. So that ancient world, touching on that ancient world, makes me think, for instance, there's a point in this poem by a Roman poet named Lucretius from the 1st century BC, where he talks about doing exactly this, looking at sheep on a hillside and how they seem to stand still even though they are moving. Often a woolly flock of sheep upon a hillside crops, a verdant pasture all a-spangle with the dew's fresh drops. And where the grass entices them, they wander one by one, and the plump lamps gambol and kick up their heels in fun. But when we view them from afar, the distance blurs the scene until it's just a patch of white upon a field of green. Now this may be, because people have looked at sheep over millennia and had the same thought over and over again. But there's something about that Babylonian that blows a kind of cold air into the poem of time and distance and vastness of millennia and how some things maybe aren't changed. It also makes me think of actual Babylonian representations of sheep. This is one. This is a 5,000-year-old stone sheep that I think is at a museum in Yale. But that idea also of the ancientness, which is human beings and their flocks. What an ancient relationship this is. I think he might also be thinking of the sort of tight, woolly curls. This isn't a very good image, but you can see how there's these stylistic curls in both the Babylonian faces of the people and in the sheep. So you kind of wonder what, even though he's perhaps an Amherst, this idea of having maybe recently looked at some ancient art, I don't know. We don't know exactly, what is going through his mind, and I'm not sure that matters. That's one of the things I'm going to explore is, I may bring a lot of things into this poem because of Babylonian. If they are supposed to be there or not, I think doesn't really matter in a sense. It just opens up something. It opens up this cold wind, as it were. This is another one of my favorite poems. Sorry, I have to. By Lewis MacNeice, who is also a favorite poet, who was born in Carrickfergus in Ireland, Northern Ireland. This poem is written in 1936, but we'll go into that. Sunlight on the Garden. It's also one of the most intricately wrought rhyming poems in existence. I challenge you to model a poem on this rhyme scheme. I don't think I could do it. The sunlight on the garden hardens and grows cold. We cannot cage the minute within its nets of gold. When all is told, we cannot beg for pardon. Our freedom as freelances advances towards its end. The earth compels. Upon it, sonnets and birds descend, and soon, my friend, we shall have no time for dances. The sky was good for flying, defying the church bells and every evil iron siren and what it tells. The earth compels. We are dying, Egypt, dying, and not expecting pardon. Hardened in heart anew, but glad to have sat under thunder and rain with you, and grateful, too, for sunlight on the garden. So you will notice that besides the end rhyme, garden rhymes with pardon in the first stanza, cold with gold and told, you have minute that seems to be hanging out there, but it's not, because it's rhyming with the beginning of the next line within it. And garden, it turns out, is rhyming with the beginning of the next line, hardens and grows cold. And this is consistent throughout the poem. Our freedom as freelances advances towards its end. The earth compels upon it, sonnets and birds descend. And soon, my friend, we shall have no time for dances. Very beautiful and intricate and interwoven. I think you all will see the bit I'm looking at, which would be, we are dying, Egypt, dying. What that does in the poem. I think this would still be a beautiful and maybe even widely anthologized poem if that were something else. We are trying, darling, trying, and not expecting pardon. But I think that moment lifts it to being a great poem. And it's a kind of strange move that it makes. I think that having got to the third stanza in an intricately rhyming poem may have also pushed the poet towards reaching and ingenuity. I don't know that the poet started off thinking that we are going to put what I would call a quotation in this poem. Like the Babylonian sheep, Egypt takes us maybe far away from Hampstead Heath, where this poem was probably composed, to another land, and a land we associate with ancient time. But furthermore, it is a quotation, or sort of, from Shakespeare, from Antony and Cleopatra. We do know, John Crowe Ransom will not be very happy with me. I'm not going to be very new criticky here. I'm going to investigate people's lives and how they might have got to this. So we do know that this was written in 1936. It's about the same time period that MacNeice is writing Letters from Iceland with W.H. Auden. It's a dark time in Europe. There's a lot of concern. He has also gone through a very bitter divorce, but kind of come out the other end of this bitter divorce with a sort of resignation, like, let us still be friends. And that is very much something that is going on in this poem, a sort of acceptance, a release of each other. We think of the garden as a place where a couple might begin in innocence of Adam and Eve. But what does this Shakespearean quotation do? And it's not even exactly, there's slightly changed. If we go and we look at this scene in Antony and Cleopatra, where Antony is being hoisted up, he is dying to say goodbye to Cleopatra, who will also soon be dying. He says, I am dying, Egypt, dying. So there's a very interesting shift where it's we are dying, Egypt, dying. Whether that is about, it's also true in the play, we will both be dying. But this play, which is about a tempestuous love that does not end well, that shift to we are dying, Egypt dying, I think is very powerful. And I think it does something to the poem where, again, you want to kind of reread it. It's some sort of central, I almost feel like a cold wind, again, blowing through time and literature that enters in that moment, in that swerve or keyhole. I'm not sure what it is doing exactly. But for me, it is one of the things that makes this poem infinitely mysterious and beautiful. This is another one of my poems. I'm not even sure what to call them, but these poems with these kind of interesting, gutsy moves. We're probably quite familiar with the Sandpiper. The roaring alongside he takes for granted, and that every so often the world is bound to shake. He runs to the south, finical, awkward, in a state of controlled panic, a student of Blake. The beach hisses like fat. On his left, a sheet of interrupting water comes and goes and glazes over his dark and brittle feet. He runs straight through it, watching his toes, watching, rather, the spaces of sand between them where, no detail too small, the Atlantic drains rapidly backwards and downwards. As he runs, he stares at the dragging grains. The world is a mist, and then the world is minute and vast and clear. The tide is higher or lower. He couldn't tell you which. His beak is focused. He is preoccupied, looking for something, something, something. Poor bird, he is obsessed. The millions of grains are black, white, tan, and gray, mixed with quartz grains, rose, and amethyst. It's a beautiful poem of observation. The beach hissing like fat. I mean, you can almost never again hear bacon cooking without hearing the sea, or vice versa. The wonderful observation of the colors at the end. But I think you'll see again the kind of moment that interests me here comes pretty close to the beginning, where it's a student of Blake. And what does that do? This is both a reference and an allusion. We have a direct reference to Blake, where she could have perhaps done just an allusion, but no, she's just going to give us the hint. This is exactly what I'm talking about, and he's a student of Blake. So we go in from a very naturalistic observation of the world is put next to a very literary view of the world, and in fact, shortly after that, it's a sheet of interrupting water. That could be a sheet of paper, perhaps. And he's a student of Blake, not just a reader of Blake. And we are meant to know, perhaps, this beginning from the auguries of innocence, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Which is actually also the only quatrain in that poem. The rest of that poem is made up of couplets, whether that, maybe having read Blake, thinking about that, looking at the Sandpiper, is all kind of combining into this poem where there's this, it is a world that he's looking at in the grains of sand. And there is a kind of answering level of register, I think, at the end, when we have the mixed with quartz grains, rose and amethyst, these jewel tones, but also amethyst is a sort of, it's a Greek word, it has a slightly elevated register, it's a slightly literary word, coming back again, even though we're talking literally about the fascination that the bird has and the person watching the bird has, with the focus on the grains of sand. This is another favorite poem. Patrick Kavanagh is an Irish poet. I don't know how well he is known in the US. If I were doing an anthology of the 100 best sonnets in the English language, he would have 2, which is a very high rate. One of them is this poem. Sorry, I have to get my papers. So he's born in 1904, he lives to 1967. He's born in Inniskeen and dies in Dublin. Inniskeen is a little town almost right at the border with Northern Ireland, to the east. The bicycles go by in 2s and 3s. There's a dance in Billy Brennan's barn tonight. And there's the half-talk code of mysteries and the wink and elbow language of delight. 8:30, and there is not a spot upon a mile of road, no shadow thrown that might turn out a man or woman, not a footfall tapping secrecies of stone. I have what every poet hates, in spite of all the solemn talk of contemplation. Oh, Alexander Selkirk knew the plight of being king and government and nation. A road, a mile of kingdom. I am king of banks and stones and every blooming thing. I love that move at the end where blooming is both a kind of curse word and is literally the flowers. It has wonderful language. You know, this moment, the bicycle's going by in 2s and 3s. We name this person Billy Brennan, who seems like a real person. I love the half-taught code of mysteries and the wink and elbow language of delight. And that wonderful lyric moment, not a footfall tapping secrecies of stone. But I think, again, you'll see the moment that I'm talking about. You know, and when I'm teaching this poem, I'll ask, you know, the group who Alexander Selkirk is. Sometimes somebody knows, but largely not. And he is a real person who was the model, one of the models, but probably the principal model for Robinson Crusoe. What is gained or lost by not making it Robinson Crusoe? There's partly it's metrical, but I think that could be finagled. I don't think that's really the main reason. So he is a privateer, a Scottish privateer, who ends up being a castaway on an island off of Chile, Masa Tierra, closer to land, which is now known as Robinson Crusoe Island. He was there for 4 years and 4 months, and a lot of the sort of adventures that happened to Robinson Crusoe happens to him. He is left by his captain with a musket, a hatchet, a knife, a cooking pot, and a Bible, and manages to live for 4 years on the wild goats of the island and, you know, makes his own clothes and so forth. So a lot of Robinson Crusoe comes out of that Alexander Selkirk. But I've thought a long time about what is gained by making it this actual person and not the maybe better known to us Robinson Crusoe. For an American, I know this wouldn't work for an Irish person, but for an American, sad to say, I think the idea that it's like this Scottish name and this Irish poem makes a little bit of sense. I know that wouldn't work for an Irish person, but as an American. There's something quite grand about Alexander Selkirk, you know, which kind of clashes maybe a bit with Billy Brennan, which is a very kind of regular kind of name with a nickname. And, you know, there's this kind of mystery that is in there, perhaps in the poem, or perhaps it is better known at that time. But it's also, I realized later, that it's a very literary move as well. Patrick Kavanagh basically left school at 13. His father was a cobbler and a farmer. He is somewhat sort of self-educated. And you think about what a poet would have, and one of the things he would have is Palgrave's Treasury. Oh, here is Alexander Selkirk in his goat clothes. And William Cooper has a poem in that very famous, like every family that had any kind of literary aspirations or middle-class aspirations at all would have Palgrave's Golden Treasury. And William Cowper has a poem, The Solitude of Alexander Selkirk, and it's where we get the very famous phrase, I am monarch of all I survey. That's probably what has survived of this poem. And you look back at the poem, the plight of being king and government and nation, a road, a mile of kingdom. It seems to be very clearly referring to this poem as well as to this person. I am monarch of all I survey. My right there is none to dispute. From the central round to the sea, I am lord of the fowl and the brute. O solitude, where are thy charms that sages have seen in thy face? Better dwell in the midst of alarms than reign in this horrible place. So I think that monarch of all I survey is one of the reasons that Alexander Selkirk is in there. I don't think it affects the poem not knowing these things. That's one of the things I think is interesting about these moves. They give a texture to the poem and maybe even a bit of a mystery to the poem. They also make me want to go down the rabbit holes and find these things out and be even more pleased with the poem. But again, it's just a wonderful textural element, even if nothing else. It kind of goes back up as a counterpart, a foil to Billy Brennan, and we kind of understand whoever Alexander Selkirk is, he knows something about solitude. I did throw this in as well, because having mentioned that poem, this is epic. This is the other Kavanagh poem I would put in this anthology. I have lived in important places, times when great events were decided. Who owned that half a rood of rock, a no man's land surrounded by our pitchfork-armed claims? I heard the Duffys shouting, damn your soul, and old McCabe stripped to the waist, seen step the plot defying blue cast steel. Here is the march along these iron stones. That was the year of the Munich bother. Which was more important? I inclined to lose my faith in Ballyrush and Gorton till Homer's ghost came whispering to my mind. He said, I made the Iliad from such a local row. Gods make their own importance. Which is, I think, a wonderful sonnet. One of the things that sonnets do, they are a plot of land. So to have borders in a plot of land discussed within the boundary plot of a sonnet is, I think, a very good use of the form. This has a couple of these moves. We have a Duffys and McCabe's, who we assume are a local family who are always at war with each other. At the end, we have Homer, who speaks directly. Homer's ghost comes and speaks directly to us at the end. We have traveled a lot of distance in this poem and talks about how he made the Iliad from an equally local skirmish. It's a sort of permission for the poet to say, my life is important, my life is epic. But I think the kind of pivotal moment, which comes, of course, at the turn, is that was the year of the Munich bother, which, if we think about this, is about the Munich Agreement, 1938, right before Hitler's kind of given permission to, there will be peace in our time, says Chamberlain, but obviously that is not going to happen. The Munich bother is what's going to kind of tick off all of World War II, but here, in this field, it's a bother. It's just a bother. Whereas the fight between the McCabes and the Duffys grows to this kind of mythic level. But it's important that the Munich bother be there, that little historical reference. There, I think, if we don't know what that is, we want to look it up. My water. This is probably the most famous, certainly the most famous of the dream songs by John Berryman. Life, friends, is boring, we must not say so. After all, the sky flashes, the great sea yearns, we ourselves flash and yearn. And moreover, my mother told me as a boy repeatedly, ever to confess you're bored means you have no inner resources. I conclude now that I have no inner resources because I am heavy bored. People bore me, literature bores me, especially great literature. Henry bores me with his plights and gripes as bad as Achilles, who loves people and valiant art, which bores me. And the tranquil hills and gin look like a drag, and somehow a dog has taken itself and its tail considerably away into mountains or sea or sky, leaving behind me wag. It's a poem that feels very free-versy, but also has its formal constraints. We have 3 stanzas of 5 longish lines and a short line that kind of parallel each other. I think you'll see the moment that I'm talking about. It seems a kind of strange thing to get Achilles in there about 2/3 through the poem when we've had this, my mother talking to me about, you need inner resources. You're always complaining that you're bored. It's in lowercase for some reason. And it sort of hangs out there, the plights and gripes as bad as Achilles, who loves people and valiant art. Is it just sort of a name check? Here is an example of great literature, the Iliad. Maybe you could say that. But again, the more I read it, the more pressure I apply there, and the more I think about it and what it might be doing there. So one of the things is that the Iliad, one of the things that we learn from the Iliad is war, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Life is boring. So much of the Iliad is Achilles not participating and sitting and complaining and strumming his guitar and abstaining from the war. And one of those moments where we hear him complaining essentially about how he has been hard done by and maybe is bored is in the first book of the Iliad, where he is complaining to his mother. And his mother is the goddess of the sea. She is Thetis, that sea that yearns. So to me, I'm not saying that we have to import this back into the poem, but I am saying that maybe, reading the Iliad and thinking about Achilles, there's a lot of mother-son conversations where Achilles is weeping and complaining, and his mother has to tell him, I'm sorry, your life is very hard, you're mortal, there's not much I can do about it. Let me see if I can find my page. In fact, the passage in book 1. Mother, since you bore me, though to be so brief a span of life. Honor surely ought to the Olympian to have given into my hands Zeus who thunders on high, but now he has honored me not a bit. And he goes on and complains about how Agamemnon has stolen his girlfriend, his spear thrall. And her answer is, my child, why do you weep? What sorrow has come upon your heart? Speak out, hide it not in your mind, that we both may know. But you do get the sense that eventually she says, yeah, life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. So I think that there is something in there that the mother and the boy and Achilles, that there is some thought of maybe reading the Iliad and thinking these things that, to me, kind of enters into the poem and makes me want to apply a little bit more pressure there and to think about it. I included this one, which I see I have messed up the spacing. I like to teach this poem as a riddle, and especially with younger students or high school students, it takes them a long time to figure out that this is a train. Maybe they don't even know the metaphor of the iron horse. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier and shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair to fit its sides and crawl between, complaining all the while in horrid hooting stanza, then chase itself downhill, and neigh like Boanerges, then prompter than a star, or punctual as a star. I like that. Having both of them there, as Monica Yoon had done. Stop docile and omnipotent at its own stable door. There's not as much pressure as that can be applied there on Boanerges. It does perhaps make us want to go look that up. It's a New Testament reference. Jesus calls the brothers James and John and Mark. Anyway, he calls them Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder, is usually how it's explained in Greek. So it's to do with sound and with, speaking loudly and perhaps preaching loudly. It can be applied to a preacher who kind of shouts and screams down on the podium. But there's also that neigh like Boanerges. And so there's this feeling of, okay, maybe this could also be the name of a horse. Maybe it could be like Bucephalus, that kind of condensing of neigh and Boanerges. And I added this bit, then prompter than a star, punctual as a star. I love the punctual as a star particularly. Again, maybe even this moment right before it had me applying a bit more pressure to some of the word choices. But if you think it's punctual, yes, it means to be on time, but it also means to be a point, to be a point in space, or to be a sharp point, which seems to me about as perfect a description of a star as one can manage. So that's a kind of slight example. This has come up in our class. A couple of times we started our class by reciting poems, and I think Paul Jones recited this one, Provide, by Robert Frost. It comes from his 1937, A Further Range. The witch that came, the withered hag, to wash the steps with pail and rag, was once the beauty Abishag, the picture pride of Hollywood. Too many fall from great and good for you to doubt the likelihood. Die early and avoid the fate, or if predestined to die late, make up your mind to die in state. Make the whole stock exchange your own. If need be, occupy a throne where nobody can call you crone. Some have relied on what they knew, others on simply being true. What worked for them might work for you. No memory of having starred atones for later disregard or keeps the end from being hard. Better to go down dignified with boughten friendship at your side than none at all. Provide. So I think, again, you'll have figured out the bit that particularly interests me for this talk, which here shows up in the first stanza. To get my paper. Which is Abishag. If we go and look this up, or we might know it, she is a very minor figure from Kings. where King David is very old and can't keep himself warm anymore. It's decided that what he really needs is a beautiful young virgin to keep him warm in bed. And they scout the land and come up with this beautiful girl, Abishag, who lies in bed with him. He doesn't have intercourse with her, but she keeps him warm somehow. There's something kind of chilling and vampiric. I don't know about that. She also has another moment a little bit later when there's a sense of the succession after King David, and King Solomon is asked by someone whose name I forget, who's a figure there, to marry Abishag. But because she still is considered that, even though they didn't consummate the relationship, she's still considered a concubine of David's, that this would disturb the succession. So that fellow is executed. So she does have a second act. But what does it do here? It's kind of a strange thing. I wouldn't want, I think, necessarily to have a footnote. Again, we have a feeling of an antique name, an antiquity, kind of blowing in. It's kind of a cool wind blowing in through the poem. Thinking as a rhyming poet, when you're doing something like rhyming tercets, I think we're used to rhyming couplets. But when you have to rhyme that third line, that's often a place where there is a move of creativity. I kind of wonder whether going into tercets, arriving at Abishag, he thought, yes, this is now going to work. You could take it out, if these were couplets, and it would be a certain kind of poem. But I think it really is this moment. And then next to it, as Mark and I were talking, the picture pride of Hollywood. So we have a very sudden shift of register. We have antiquity, Old Testament story, and then we have Hollywood. And that clash certainly puts a lot of energy into the poem. And there is a moment kind of at the end that answers that a little bit in terms of register. We have that very homespun word, boughten, which kind of is the opposite of saying Abishag. And in fact, I think he is not necessarily assuming that we will know who Abishag is, because he says the beauty Abishag. I mean, that if you knew the reference, you wouldn't have to put beauty in front of it, because we know that her sole purpose is that she is a virgin, very young and very beautiful. And in fact, if you Google Abishag, you will come up with a lot of very creepy Christian websites about how girls can marry at 12. But I was also thinking, again, it's 1937, and Mark was explaining to me that this is an anti-New Deal poem. But certainly make the stock market your own is going to have a resonance, given that it's 1937. But also thinking about Hollywood and these black and white films and so on. There's a lot of films in the silent film era that are about biblical scenes that involve a lot of exoticism and fancy costumes. One of these is The Queen of Sheba in 1921. I think we have lost this film, but we know it from stills. And Betty Blythe this was her big starring role. She did a lot of films, but this is the one that she is remembered for. She basically is in a translucent gown, or sometimes naked with just like a topless with just a necklace. So it has the exoticism and it has the eroticism that is allowed by setting it in biblical times, and that these are biblical stories. Interestingly, besides the risque costumes, she is someone who made a fortune selling a lot of the land that is the Sunset Strip, millions of dollars, all of which she lost in the stock market. I'm not saying that this is this person. There should be an Abishag in this film, given what scenes it is covering, but there is no one listed as Abishag. And again, I'm not saying that he is thinking of this person or this film, and I'm not saying he is not. That there is, you think of those movie palaces that were, made to look like beautiful Egyptian temples and Islamic scenes. There was this exoticism. So I think that Abishag in Hollywood, you also think, is this someone who played Abishag? Is this someone who was in a film like Queen of Sheba? As well as thinking of her as Abishag, which is, I think, a very neat move that is done by simply juxtaposing those two things. I was also thinking of a wonderful poem by Turner Cassidy that describes the Fox Theater in Atlanta, which is one of these that's just amazing. Whenever in that ceiling sky, familiar clouds once more go by, and in the restrooms far below, 1/2 the lamps of Islam glow. So I think of these kind of movie palaces and thinking of Abishag and this exoticism. So this is a poem I've thought about a lot during the pandemic for some reason or other. And it doesn't necessarily have one moment like those that I described, but I think it is doing a lot of these things. There is allusion, there is quotation, there is reference. I think there are all of the things that I'm talking about, which maybe you would think is some of it is part of modernism, but I think that this isn't about modernism, it's about these very sharp shifts. A Disused Shed in County Wexford by Derek Mann, an Irish poet who died in 2020. So I think that was one of the reasons why this poem was very much on my radar. Even now, there are places where a thought might grow, Peruvian mines worked out and abandoned to a slow clock of condensation, an echo trapped forever, and a flutter of wildflowers in the lift shaft. Indian compounds where the wind dances and a door bangs with diminished confidence, lime crevices behind rippling rain barrels, dog corners for bone burials, and in a disused shed in County Wexford, deep in the grounds of a burnt-out hotel, among the bathtubs and the wash basins, 1,000 mushrooms crowd to a keyhole. This is the one star in their firmament, or frames a star within a star. What should they do there but desire? So many days beyond the rhododendrons, with the world waltzing in its bowl of cloud, they have learnt patience and silence, listening to the rooks querulous in the high wood. They have been waiting for us in a fetor of vegetable sweat since Civil War days, since the gravel crunching, interminable departure of the expropriated mycologist. He never came back, and light since then is a keyhole rusting gently after rain. Spiders have spun, flies dusted to mildew, and once a day perhaps they have heard something, a trickle of masonry, a shout from the blue, or a lorry changing gear at the end of the lane. There have been deaths, the pale flesh flaking into the earth that nourished it, and nightmares born of these and the grim dominion of stale air and rank moisture. Those nearest the door grow strong. Elbow room, the rest dim in a twilight of crumbling utensils and broken pitchers groaning for their deliverance, have been so long expectant there is left only the posture. A half-century without visitors in the dark. Poor preparation for the cracking lock and creak of hinges. Magi, moon men, powdery prisoners of the old regime, web-throated, stalked like triffids, racked by doubt and insomnia. Only the ghost of a scream at the flashbulb firing squad we wake them with shows there is life yet in their feverish forms. Grown beyond nature now, soft food for worms, they lift frail heads in gravity and good faith. They are begging us, you see, in their wordless way, to do something, to speak on their behalf, or at least not to close the door again. Lost people of Treblinka and Pompeii, save us, they seem to say. Let the God not abandon us who have come so far in darkness and in pain. We too had our lives to live. You with your light meter and relaxed itinerary, let not our naive labors have been in vain. I admire a lot of things about this poem. Just the wonderful textures. I wish I had a poem that could get all these textures in there, just even the things. That this is an entire poem, 60-line poem about mushrooms is impressive. It's obviously about other things as well. We have a lot of very quick shifts. For instance, we have a quotation from the very beginning, or we might even look at the title. The title puts us in mind of other titles. I think perhaps mostly of James Wright's poem with the long lying in a hammock in so-and-so's farm in Pine, whatever, Minnesota. Is there a little bit of a nod to that, which is itself a poem that nods to Rilke? There is this quotation from George Seferis, the Greek Nobel Prize winner, from his poem Mythistórema, which is a poem in 20, and Mythistórema means novel in Greek. It's just the word for novel, but it happens also to be the word that means myth history. That's how we say novel in Greek. And it's in 24 sections and somewhat follows the books of the Odyssey. And book 24 is the souls, perhaps, of the suitors. And so we have this, let them not forget us, the weak souls among the asphodels. That's kind of a bold move there. We also have a dedication. I haven't tracked down J.G. Farrell. So we have all of this stuff before it even starts, where we have the wonderful images of the mushrooms in this disused shed. If you look at the third stanza, they have been waiting for us in a fetor of vegetable sweat since Civil War days. This will be the Civil War in Ireland around 1922. So then you also wonder why this shed is disused. So there's already a political element that has been imported into the poem. There have been deaths, we are told, in the fourth stanza, the pale flesh flaking into the earth that nourished it, and nightmares born of these and the grim dominion of stone. Elbow room, and this being a poem about mushrooms, puts me very much in mind of Sylvia Plath's poem Mushrooms, where it's all about having more room, and it's about the meek inheriting the earth. The rest, dim in a twilight of crunching utensils and broken pitchers, groaning for their deliverance, have been so long expectant there's only the posture. A half century, so we are 50 years on from the Civil War. And in fact, this poem is written in 1972. It's written shortly after Bloody Sunday on January 30th, 1972, which ends up making it a political poem. I think Derek Mann himself had some doubts about this poem. It's one of his most popular, but it's a poem he himself had some doubts about. Because it does make some very bold moves. We have, creaks of hinges, we have magi, we have moon men, we have powdery prisoners of the old regime, where we think perhaps of Bastille. Web-throated, stalked like triffids. We get science fiction in there, racked by drought and insomnia. And we have the flash bulb firing squad, which again makes us think, what happened in this disused shed that has been shut up since the Civil War? They are begging us, you see, in their wilderness way, to do something, to speak on their behalf. And I think for me, the one that is most like the other moments, and is a very risky moment, is Lost People of Treblinka and Pompeii, which is now linking these mushrooms both to the Holocaust and to this natural disaster. Save us, they seem to say. Let the God not abandon us, a strange nod to Cavafy, who have come so far in darkness and in pain. We too had our lives to live, you with your light meter and relaxed itinerary. And again, this seems to make us complicit in standing by while these disasters happen. I love that light meter. For those of you who don't remember photographing things with actual cameras, there was a thing called a light meter that would read the light for you so you could do the right exposure on your film. But I think in a poem, it also seems to refer to the light meter of the poem and your relaxed itinerary. You're just a tourist here, but bad things have happened in this place. Let not our naive labors have been in vain. So for me, I think it works. I think it's risky. It's a lot of shuffling in register. There's a lot of reference in here. And it's one of the ways, you can get a 60-line poem from mushrooms. And I'll look at just a couple more. This is a poem, I think, that makes this move also, but in a different kind of way. The famous poem, one of the famous poems by Cesar Vallejo, a Peruvian poet, Blackstone on a White Stone. This poem is also related to a cluster of other poems, including a poem by a Greek poet, a Swiss poet, then there are imitations by Donald Justice and so on. Again, it's a sonnet. This is a translation by Geoffrey Brock that tries to keep the rhyming. I'll die in Paris in the pouring rain, a day I have a memory of already. I'll die in Paris. I won't try to run. A Thursday, perhaps, in autumn, like today. A Thursday, yes, because today, as I prose these verses, I've put my upper arm bones on poorly, and today, turning toward all my road, I see myself, as never before, alone. Cesar Vallejo is dead. Everyone hit him, though he's not doing them the slightest harm. They let him have it, hard with rods and hard with ropes. These are his witnesses, Thursdays, and the bones of his upper arms, and loneliness, and falling rain, and roads. So for me, the poet's name here becomes its reference. It's kind of a neat move. And it is much more for us, perhaps, because we're looking back to the poet actually being dead. It seems to project itself into the future as a historical reference. And I think it's a very interesting move. I guess Catullus and Sappho also refer to themselves directly in their poems. But this moment has a very chilling move to it, that it has to be the full name somehow. That somehow others it in the poem as not being I or me. It's looking at this self almost as an alien person. It's kind of interesting that Cesar Vallejo does die in Paris, but it is in the spring and on a Friday. This is a poem by a young poet, Richie Hoffman, and I thought I'd end on it. It maybe is doing something slightly different from some of the other poems, but it is a poem that also, by an extreme register shift, lets in a kind of cold blast of mystery and strangeness. Richie Hoffman often writes homoerotic poems about desire that are often set in Europe. And it is entitled Under Limestone, and it appeared in the New Yorker. It rained in fluted torrents. The earth smelled of manure. It was like desire entering and possessing you quietly. We undressed. The sun through the windows made shapes on the couch I lay face down on. Our jeans were soaked and wrinkled on the radiator, our socks heavy. Then your eyes were opening a little. Then you could hear the moped starting up again. When it was dry enough, we found a small bistro where we had Prosecco and fries and took pictures of one another in our damp clothes under trees and buildings of the hated regime. I would put that hated regime in that same category, whether with Babylonian and so forth, where it sends shockwaves back up through the poem. This seems to be a poem about love. There are suggestions that something else is going on. And I haven't discussed this poem with Richie, so perhaps he could explain it to me. But under limestone, which makes me think of maybe being in a cave or being in an underworld. It rained in fluted torrents. I love that because both I think of the fluting of columns and the rivulets of rain and perhaps a sound, perhaps it's doing, but then the earth smells of manure. So again, once I get to the bottom of this poem with hated regime, I read the poem differently. It was dry enough, we found a small bistro where we had Prosecco and fries. This seems European and elegant and cozy all at the same time. But again, ending on this hated regime, perhaps this is in Paris, and we're thinking of previous regimes, but it also almost feels like this is the hall of death. It has this effect on me. And again, I'm not saying that Richie is putting that in there, but for me, it becomes this kind of otherworldly, underworld place. And for those of you who have the packet, you'll see a lot of different poems of this kind that I'm putting in these categories, as well as where I can, I trace the allusions for you. Again, I think it's not about necessarily knowing the allusions, but about feeling that there is something behind and beyond the poem and having these portals open up into different worlds. Thank you.